Hello, everyone. I'm Jenny LeRae. Welcome to today's Research America Alliance member discussion. If your organization is not a member, we invite you to stay as our guest, but please get in touch with my good colleague, Joel, and he will connect with you to discuss the tremendous value that comes with being a member of our alliance. And you can find his email in the chat. So today, we're so pleased to be joined by Stephen Grossman, Executive Director of the Alliance for a Stronger FDA. Steve is here to discuss all things related to the FDA budget, including some hot off the press House markup info. And we work very closely with the Alliance in terms of advocating for a strong FDA. So we not only welcome Steve being here today, but also welcome all the work that he does on behalf of the FDA. So this is going to be a kind of an Oprah style interview. Please put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and when I get to sort of a critical mass of my questions, we will turn over to yours. So Steve, the FDA budget does differ in a fairly substantive way from that of its peer agencies like NIH, NSF, et cetera. Can you remind us why that's so?
Okay. Well, let me start by saying I appreciate your bracketing us with them, because I have an ongoing battle with science that as to whether or not FDA is a research agency. And the answer is yes, it is, and it should be counted as part of the government's research budget. On the other hand, it's a regulatory agency, and the research is part of being a regulatory agency, not something that's freestanding. So the FDA budget is, despite being about sixth or a seventh the size of NIH, is considerably more complicated. And that's because it has a number of different funding sources. The best known are budget authority, which is the taxpayer money, and the user fees. But then there are two entirely different kinds of user fees. Plus, we get a little bit of your cures money, about $50 million to support certain of NIH. The money goes to NIH, and we get $50 million a year from it. So there are about 5 different sources. The main two are budget authority and user fees. So part of it's a regulatory agency. Another is that it has a lot more different functions. I usually use the Social Security Administration to pick on it, which is tens of thousands of employees and trillions of dollars. But when you break down the agency, it does about 7 things, millions of times, but just about 7 different things, such as, validating births and deaths and benefits, paying checks, et cetera. It's only about 7 or 8 things. I could start with the different things that FDA does and start listing them, and 2 hours later, I still wouldn't be done with the list. And that's not true of very many agencies. It's not true of NIH or NSF. It's usually not quite as extreme as my comparison with Social Security. So that's one way. Now, in that, user fees play a role, but they do not replace taxpayer, the BA funding. My first separation is there are 2 completely different kinds of user fees that we call user fees and are blended together, but they really aren't the same thing. Tobacco user fees is a mandatory program in law. The tobacco industry has no interest in it being useful and productive, and it's forever. It's not a 5-year renewable. The medical products user fees, which is what most of us think of, are cooperative agreements between the government and the industry for which fees are collected attached to certain events like acceptances of proposals and things like that. And then the money is spent according to the 5-year plan that's been negotiated. So it's a collaborative deal. And the user fee monies can only be spent for specific purposes. They do not support the general service, the general functioning of the agency. They don't pay for any of the real public health functions as opposed to the products. And even the products, it does not cover all of the costs of product reviews. In Cedar, it's about somewhere around 30% is paid for by budget authority. And with all the other programs, biosimilars, medical devices, the percentage of taxpayer money is much higher than that. So it's great. The agency needs user fees and it's achieved its purpose, or industry would not come back each time and FDA wouldn't be agreeable to it. But the gist is they want faster reviews with more reviewers. They don't get a guaranteed yes or no, but they get more staff for more attention and a more predictable calendar. It's a great trade-off. We support that. But at the same time, the alliance's part is focused on the taxpayer part, the BA part. And there's two reasons for that. One of which is user fees don't really need advocates. It sort of sells itself because Congress and industry and FDA all benefit from it. Whereas the taxpayer money, we're competitive because we're in Ag FDA subcommittee, not in Labor H. We don't compete with NIH for funds, but we certainly compete with agricultural research, commodity subsidies, feeding programs. And the money that's at risk is the budget authority appropriations, the taxpayers. And it's the number for 2023 is $3.5 billion. So it's far from insubstantial. The other part that's important is from the point of view of the appropriations committee, the user fees are an automatic pass-through. The administration says how much they need to collect based on the rules and the work plan. The number comes down in the president's request, and it's predictable that will be the number at the end. So appropriations committee staff pay significantly less attention to the funds for which they must appropriate, but which they have no control over, even setting the levels. So that's some of the ways that.
No, Stephen, that's a super helpful kind of level setting in terms of the role of the user fees. Now, let's talk about budget authority. Let's talk about appropriations. So what did the Alliance think of the president's budget request for FY24? What was it? How big of an increase?
Well, as I said, the FY23 is $3.5 billion, and that includes food and med. And for those who are only focused on medical products, it's a good deal broader than that. And on the $3.5 billion base, the administration requested a $372 million increase. And I don't know any context in which a 10% increase is not considered a good one.
Right.
Process. So we were very happy with it. Did you want me to sort of break down where the 372 goes, what the priorities are?
Not just yet, because there is some information that's hot off the press, and I think it will be helpful to look at what you've learned in terms of the House markup tomorrow. So the House Ag Subcommittee is going to be marking up, and in their rules, they have to release a draft of the markup document 24 hours before. So I think you have this hot off the presses. So can you share with us the House's thinking right now, or at least the House majority's thinking on the FDA?
Sure, you get to hear it before my own members. So good timing. So the markup document, now to be clear, this is the Republican majority allocation, their proposed bill that will be marked up tomorrow. There can be changes. There can be changes because there may be amendments that come up that may or may not affect FDA. And also, they themselves can make changes in the draft that they've circulated. The key is at the beginning of of the markup, if the chairman says he has a chairman's amendment, that reflects everything they thought of in the last 24 hours that they wanted to change from today's draft. That said, it's pretty clear what they're trying to do and how they're trying to do it. We've all been concerned because it is in Speaker McCarthy's interest for the House Appropriations Committee to mark up bills at the level that the House has proposed for total spending. So that's why they're on it quickly. And we know what they proposed for FDA, and I'm going to put it in larger context because it also seems to me this is the kind of information you're going to face somewhere in the next couple of weeks when they mark up labor HHS. Namely, FDA has proposed for level funding with the FY23 level. So they're proposing 3.5 billion in BA or taxpayer funding for the year. Now, there's a couple of things that means there's no money for the president's request, which, wasn't favoritism. There's really growing needs at FDA, particularly in food safety. There's a new cosmetic safety program. There's money in the request for cancer, for the cancer moonshot. There's a lot of good stuff in there that reflects the fact that FDA's mission and responsibilities are not stagnant. They grow each year. Science becomes more complex. There are new laws, et cetera. So one thing it doesn't include is money for the newly stated priorities, many of which are continuing ones. The second thing is I'm sorry, I think I just said that. The other thing is the FDA asked for monies, and that 372 is $105 million to pay for pay increases. And what will happen is at flat funding, FDA will have to find the 105 million from existing programs. Now, given the way the FDA budget is done, that's not unusual, but it does mean that it's not truly a flat funded budget proposal. Now, the other thing that's really important to understand is how the Democrats are viewing what's proposed, because the House passed spending limitation wouldn't allow for most agencies to have flat funding. And the answer to that, as I say, this really affects NIH as much as it does us. What they've done is the committee has allotted itself about the same 24 billion it had for ag FDA programs last year. However, it's 18 billion, it's 16 to 18 billion. I don't have the numbers exactly right yet. 16 to 18 billion in traditional budget authority taxpayer money, and $7 or $8 billion that comes from rescissions and clawbacks of the unspent pandemic money. So that means that when we get to, if were this to become law as is, those are monies you can only spend once. And we'd be looking at a true base for ag FDA that would be about 1/3 less than it is now, and as it's being proposed to be funded. So it doesn't look so bad given the larger environment, but it has in it if you will, a ticking time bomb that makes FY25 explosive and not just another day.
Thanks, Stephen. It's really, we're really fortunate to have you on here as the House is preparing to mark up. You mentioned a few of the president's priorities that wouldn't be funded at level funding. You mentioned the cancer moonshot. Are there some other items in the medical product space that come to mind?
Well, continued increases in monies for opioids.
Mm-hmm.
It is, with all the congressional interest in infant formula, in tobacco,
Mm-hmm.
some other hot issues we won't discuss. There is a goodly part of the Senate and the House come from districts and states where opioid addiction is ravishing their communities, and
Mhm.
it is on a put your dollars where they matter. Opioids is one of the number one items in the FDA budget. It's the
Mhm.
largest, but it's the one that Congress keeps coming back to as an urgent priority of Congress.
Mhm. Mhm.
Cancer moonshot, I'd mentioned, you may be doing a program on this as well, but on June 20th, we're going to have Dr. Paul Kluwitz, who's the deputy director in the Office of Cancer, the Oncology Center of Excellence, come and present to the webinar, to a webinar we're doing about progress in OCE, but specifically what they have in mind for the $50 million if it's appropriated.
Mhm.
Maybe you could pass through in the Thursday evening report or whatever, a link
Mhm.
to that program, because it should be interesting, and it's a piece of the cancer moonshot that's very, I mean, it's very important. You can't get, in most aspects, you can't get from the bench to the bedside without taking something through the FDA process.
Mhm. Mhm.
So all that cancer money needs to have a sufficient amount in FDA as well.
So you wrote a commentary, and geez, I'm blanking on where I saw it, but you described the current crisis surrounding the debt ceiling um, as the need to revisit the quote iron triangle of deficit reduction. So Stephen, can you share with us what the iron triangle of deficit reduction is in your mind?
I would be happy to. And by the way, the reason you saw it is because I sent it to you.
Oh, you're so modest.
Um, okay, the way we have come to look at budget issues on behalf of FDA is that there's macro budgetary issues and there are micro budgetary issues. Macro is how much are we going to spend? How much of a deficit are we willing to have? How much goes to defense? How much goes to non-defense? And the micro budget is, what do they think about FDA? Do they think the programs need more money, less money? And NIH has its own micro and macro. It's much bigger, and it maybe occasionally can affect the macro picture. But for the most part, the macro is outside of what we can do much about it, because it's driven by these larger forces of how much is being spent, and not particular to any of us. That said, the largest macro question is, how do we tame federal spending if we think it's excessive? If we're concerned about the debt limit, which in turn always has to be raised every couple of years because we run an annual deficit as well. And at some point, the accumulation of the annual deficit, which at this point is more than $1 trillion, that at some point that becomes borrowing and requires an increase in the debt limit. So here's the iron triangle of deficit reduction. There's only 3 ways, hence my little triangle, for reducing the deficit, whether it's the annual deficit or the annual deficit that becomes part of the cumulative debt. And that is, you can cut discretionary programs, you can raise taxes or find other ways to stimulate growth in the country that produces more taxes, and you can cut entitlements or make changes in entitlement that net dollars. And the fundamental part of the iron triangle is it's a scale issue. If you took away all discretionary spending, it's about $1.5 trillion, and that includes defense and if you took it all away, no defense, no veterinary program, veterans programs, no NIH, no FDA, no Department of Education, that would not solve the annual deficit problem. And from that, what comes from the iron triangle is, at some point Congress will need to address either taxes or entitlements, because they can make discretionary programs that kick and boy for as long as they want, but ultimately you can't solve the problem with discretionary programs. In fact, the numbers that are proposed to be saved are meaningful on one level, and then in this larger picture, they're really not meaningful at all. The way to solve this has to be a combination of the three, with most of it being on the other two parts of the triangle.
Thank you, Stephen. I think it's a helpful way that you've put it. Let's get back to the FDA, and I want to remind our participants that there's probably no one in Washington with a better mind for the FDA budget than Mr. Grossman. So if you think it's too narrow or nerdy a question, it's probably not for Stephen. So please fire away. People often will talk about the FDA's role as a share of the U.S. economy. Is it 20% of the consumer economy that goes through the FDA?
Yes, it's 20% of all consumer spending is on products and services that are overseen and in many cases regulated by FDA. That includes all food, well, 80% of the food supply, all medical products, similars over the counter. Cosmetics is actually a huge market, as is dietary supplements. And that goes back to I could spend 2 hours describing all the different functions that FDA performs. So,
well, I think that a fifth of the U.S. economy relying on one agency is so critical and such important parts of our economy as well. You mentioned that flat funding would also harm the agency's ability to provide salary increases. And when you're dealing, one of the reasons why we embrace the FDA as a research agency and so do others is because in large part because it's staffed by scientists, it's staffed by researchers. Some of the most talented, highly qualified people across the federal government. This might be a loaded question, but why is it that salaries are important for an agency like the FDA?
Great, thank you. We didn't discuss that question, but it's a great one. I appreciate being asked it. Well, first of all, the pay raises are mandatory. No matter what, that $105 million is going to come from somewhere. So that's good news. We're not going to be further behind in paying for scientists and other professionals. But that leaves a further question, which I think is important. FDA needs a very high percentage of well-trained individuals just because it's so complex. So much of what it does is complex. So much of it requires, and I'll use just because we often talk about the cutting edge part of FDA, which we may come to yet. And, you can't evaluate a program that relies on artificial intelligence or blockchain unless your agency has that expertise. And it's not just at the end of evaluation, but it's also all the way along in the process. The companies are typically, especially with cutting edge stuff, they're talking to the agency, and the agency is saying, well, if you want to go that way, here's how it'll be evaluated, but you might want to consider doing it this way, and then we'll give you this kind of evaluation. Again, you can't do that without expertise. And so the agency is in constant need of PharmDs, biostatisticians, PhDs, MDs, PhD, MDs, and all sorts of technical categories that go beyond my understanding. And recruitment in that regard is very hard for the agency because even in food, they're competing with an industry that can generally pay more than FDA does. And so the pay raises are mandatory, but it doesn't make the attraction and retention of employees go away. And in
Mhm.
fact, we have a webinar on that also coming up June 5th,
Mhm.
having
Sure.
Julie Tierney, who is the chief of staff to Commissioner Califf, and she's going to give an overview of the employment situation in 2023, which will cover recruitment, retention,
Mhm.
different pay scales. But we'll also get into other things like back to work and the
Mhm.
challenges faced by FDA, because one of the ways it solved some of its expertise needs during the pandemic was to recruit people from outside the DC area with the understanding they were not going to need to come and relocate to White Oak or Maryland or one of the facilities. And that helped a lot. It was really important, but at the same time, FDA is like every large employer, which is
Mhm.
something with how much do people have to be on
Sure.
versus
Mhm.
working from their homes. And needless to say, working from your home is a very popular option.
I'm going to ask my colleague Jacqueline Lagoy to come on the screen, and Stephen, she's going to pose a couple of participant questions to you.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Stephen, for this great discussion so far. One question from the audience: is there any report language or markup addressing FDA reorganization or any other clues to how that might work that you know about?
Okay, well, so far we have the draft bill, we have the Republican press release, we have the Democratic press release. They'll mark up tomorrow, but typically we don't see the committee report until after the full committee markup. So if they're following what the announced intention was to mark up this week at subcommittee, and for the ones they do at subcommittee this week to mark up at full committee next week. I would expect something in report language that would address the reorganization of the Office of Regulatory Affairs, which also affects the food programs. It affects all of FDA, but particularly the food programs. I would expect there to be some report language on that, but I don't know what it'll say, and it'll be at least next week before we'll get a look at that.
Got it. Thank you. Next question. I am curious about really dynamic parts of healthcare like obesity and diabetes and digital health that are submitting to FDA. How does FDA, where needed, have capacity to ramp up, especially in places where valuable new data is coming in or innovative new platforms are being used that they may take more time to assess but are even more useful? To what degree is hiring and funding more or less challenging right now?
Can I get you to come to June 5th and ask that question to Julie Tierney? Not that I can't give you, it's a challenge. FDA gets its expertise both from hiring people, from consultants, from advisory committees. But it is a challenge because when you look at, who's in demand, who are you competing with, not surprisingly, digital health, blockchain, artificial intelligence, or everybody's trying to hire, or the staple of all scientific agencies, regulatory ones at least, are biostatisticians. And we're not only competing with the private sector, we're competing with CDC, NIH, NSF. And oh, by the way, they aren't producing nearly enough biostatisticians to feed any of us. So quite a challenge in that regard. I'm concerned that even with the pay raises in, even with the salary, the ability to bump up salaries that FDA has been granted by Congress, that an agency that's seen as under tight pressure, stretching people even further than they have been during the pandemic, may be seen as a less desirable place to work. And if you can't fully compete on salary, then you need to sell people on the public goal and how you're helping the nation. But people are willing to put up with a little less salary and a working place that's not as good. That's a problem. So that's why having Julie come on June 5th and give us an overview of how all these things are pieced together in FDA's mind is so.
So Stephen, we've put that program in the chat so folks can sign up. Before we close though, for those who may not already be working with the Alliance, for, as advocates, what's the best way to plug in? Will you be doing any grassroots outreach to members of Congress? How can people plug into the advocacy you're doing?
Well, I think the place to start is to join, and for organizations and individuals, it's very affordable. For larger companies, it's well worth it. Our focus is really in DC in terms of lobbying, just because we don't have the capacity to go state to state. However, we've just brought into membership several of the state-based organizations like the Association of Food and Drug Officials. And so we're hoping to have, if not a full component of grassroots, at least the ability when a senator or a congressman says, well, we'll only meet with you if you have somebody from the district. And that comes up often enough, and we'll now have some access to state officials, and we'd love to have a broader network. I pretty much know where every single member is that's outside of DC. But join. The best way to get in touch with me, which you could also put in the chat, is Grossman at strengthenfda.org. We do a lot of different things. We produce a Friday update. We have a webinar series that you can hear. We lobby. I produce analysis. Yeah, I'm a nerd, Jenny. I just can't help it.
That's a badge. That's a badge in Washington, no question. So I'm going to let you get back to your nerding out and following up on the House markup tomorrow. This has been super informative. We will be continuing to work with you for sure. We certainly can't let flat funding for the FDA or any of our key agencies stand. The economy is moving too quickly. Innovation's moving too quickly. Patient needs are only growing. So we've got to really pull together and get back to what makes sense. Get back to what makes sense for our country. So thank you so much, Stephen. And for those of us still on the call, we actually are hearing from Dr. Peter Marks next week, who is the center director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, CBER, at FDA. And he's not going to talk about funding per se. He's going to talk about the work that the agency is doing in gene therapy, which is, as many of you know, one of the most promising and challenging areas right now in life science. So if you're a Research Alliance member, this one is closed, open only to Research America Alliance members. So if you are one, please email Jacqueline and she will send you the link. Thanks again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again. Take care.